The bells rang for the dead at 10:30. Hannah counted them. 12. One for each year of the woman's marriage. She hadn't asked the bell ringer to do that. He'd chosen it himself because he'd liked Joan Healy, because everyone had liked Joan Healy, because Joan Healy had been someone who brought soup to the sexton when his back went, and who sang the hymns loudly and slightly off-key, and who laughed in church, which some women did and some women did not, and Joan had. And the bell ringer rang 12 times because 12 years of marriage was what Joan had been given and what Joan would not get more of. Hannah stood at the back of the church, not in a pew. She had come early enough to sit, had arrived before the family, before the village, before the coffin, but she had not sat. She stood because she knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent years reading rooms before entering them, that if she sat, someone would stand up and move, and if someone stood up and moved, the movement would be noticed, and the noticing would become the story of the funeral instead of Joan, and Joan deserved better than that. Joan deserved better than all of this. 3 days ago, Hannah had been in the bedroom of the Healy cottage with her hands inside Joan Healy's body, trying to stop a hemorrhage that wouldn't stop. The baby, a girl, 7 pounds, healthy lungs, a furious cry that filled the room, had come at 4:20 in the morning. The birth had been clean, the baby had turned, the cord had been whole. Hannah had caught the child in hands that had caught over 200 children, and for 9 minutes everything was well. And then Joan began to bleed. Not the ordinary bleeding that follows birth, the bleeding that Hannah had seen 1,000 times and knew how to manage, the bleeding that stopped with pressure and time and patience. This was the other kind, the kind that came from inside, from a place the hands could not reach, from a tear in the womb that no compress could close, and no herb could slow, and no midwife, however skilled, however experienced, however desperate, could fix. Hannah tried. She tried for 47 minutes. She used every technique she knew, the compresses, the elevation, the cold cloths, the tincture she carried in the bag her mother had given her, used 11 times before, effective 9 of those 11. This wasn't one of the 9. Joan died at 11 minutes past 5. The baby was alive in a basket by the fire. The room smelled of iron and tallow, and the exhaustion that belongs to rooms where someone has fought very hard to keep a person alive and has failed. Hannah cleaned Joan's body. She washed the blood from Joan's face and hands. She closed Joan's eyes. She wrapped Joan in the sheet she had brought, clean, white, the sheet she always brought because she knew, after years, that the families couldn't be expected to have one ready, and the first thing a dead woman deserved was to be wrapped in something clean. Then she picked up the baby. The baby was crying. The baby didn't know that her mother was dead. The baby knew only that she was hungry and cold, and that the world she had entered 9 minutes ago was louder and brighter and less warm than the world she had left. Hannah held her against her chest. She sat in the chair by the fire, the chair where Joan had sat through her pregnancy, mending Robert's shirts, talking to the baby inside her, and she fed the baby from a cloth dipped in milk, because Joan was dead, and Joan's milk was gone, and the baby needed to eat, and someone had to do it. She was still sitting in the chair when Robert Healy came in from the barn. He looked at the basket, empty. He looked at Hannah, holding the baby. He looked at the bed. He saw the sheet. He saw the shape beneath it. He didn't speak. He walked to the bed. He pulled back the sheet. He looked at Joan's face for a long time. Then he replaced the sheet and walked out of the room and into the yard, and the sound he made wasn't a word. It was the sound a man makes when the thing that held his life together has been removed and the structure has not yet understood that it is falling. Hannah stayed. She stayed because someone had to feed the baby, and someone had to sit with Joan, and someone had to be in the room when the body cooled, and the candle burned down, and the dawn came through the window, and the rooster crowed in the yard, as though nothing had changed, as roosters do, as the world does, as everything does, except the people inside the room. She stayed until Joan's mother came. Bridget Healy arrived at 7 in the morning. She was 61. She was small, broad in the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by Dorset rain and Dorset wind into something that looked carved from the local stone. Not soft, not decorative, functional. She came through the door without knocking. She looked at Joan. She looked at the baby. She looked at Hannah. "You did everything," Bridget said. "I did." "It wasn't enough." "No." Bridget crossed the room. She took the baby from Hannah's arms. She held the child, her grandchild, the child of her dead daughter, and she looked at Hannah with eyes that carried grief and gratitude, and the understanding that the woman sitting in the chair had fought for 47 minutes to save the woman under the sheet, and that 47 minutes was not the same as not trying. "Go home, Hannah," Bridget said. "You've been here all night. Go home." Hannah went home. Home was a cottage at the edge of the village. 2 rooms, a garden, a still room where she kept her herbs and her oils and her linens, and the bag with the brass clasp her mother had carried before her. Her mother had been the village midwife before Hannah, her grandmother before that. The Wyatt women had caught babies in this village for 3 generations, who knew which herbs slowed bleeding and which hastened it, who knew what a healthy birth sounded like and what a dangerous one sounded like, who had saved hundreds and lost 12 out of more than 600 births, and who were trusted, respected, needed, and never thanked enough. Hannah's mother had told her, "The ones who live won't remember your name. The ones who die, their families will never forget it." Joan was the 12th. Hannah didn't sleep. She washed her hands. She washed them again. She washed them a 3rd time, in water she had boiled and cooled, because clean hands were the foundation of everything she did, everything her mother had taught her, everything the Wyatt women had always known, that hands must be clean before they touch a laboring woman, that instruments must be boiled, that linens must be fresh, that the room must be aired. These were not things the physicians did. Hannah had seen physicians arrive at births with blood still on their coats from the last patient, with instruments that hadn't been washed, with hands that had come straight from a dissection or a surgery and gone directly into a woman's body. She had seen what happened after. She had counted those deaths too. She sat in her kitchen. She drank cold tea. She waited for the funeral. The church was full. Joan Healy had been liked, and in a village of 300 people, being liked was sufficient to fill every pew. The men stood along the walls. The women sat. The coffin was at the front, on trestles, covered in wildflowers that Joan's mother had picked from the hedgerows that morning. Cow parsley and foxgloves and dog roses, the flowers of a Dorset summer, because Joan had died in July, and the hedgerows were full, and Bridget Healy wasn't going to put hothouse flowers on her daughter when the fields were blooming. The Reverend Elias Wyatt stood at the pulpit. He was 60, tall, thin, straight-backed, in the way that clergymen are straight-backed, not through physical discipline but through the architectural requirements of moral authority. His hair was white and sparse. His eyes were gray, and they held the certainty of a man who had read one book his entire life and had found in it the answer to every question. He wore his surplice and stole. His hands rested on the edge of the pulpit. They were long hands, thin-fingered, the hands of a man who had never worked with them and who had spent 40 years gesturing with them instead, pointing at Scripture, pointing at sin, pointing at the distance between what the world was and what God intended it to be. He was Hannah's father. He looked at the congregation. He looked at the coffin. He didn't look at Hannah. He had not looked at Hannah in 6 years, not since the day she had told him, in the vestry after the morning service, that she didn't believe that women's suffering in childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's sin, that the pain wasn't divine, that it was physical, that it could be eased. That easing, it wasn't defiance of God, but service to him, because a God who demanded suffering as payment for knowledge was not a God she recognized. He had asked her to leave the vestry. She had left. She hadn't returned to his church until today. She stood at the back. He stood at the front. The distance between them was 30 feet and 6 years, and the entire width of a theological disagreement that had cost Hannah her father and cost her father his daughter, and that neither of them had found a way to bridge, since the bridge required one of them to be wrong, and neither of them was wrong, and neither of them was right, and the space between those two certainties was exactly the width of a church. Elias Wyatt read the lesson. He read from Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born and a time to die. He read it well. He had a good voice, deep, measured, the voice of a man who believed what he was saying, and who expected others to believe it too. The village listened. They always listened. Elias Wyatt had been their vicar for 32 years, and his authority was the kind that is not questioned, because questioning it would mean questioning the structure that held the village together, and the village didn't want to be unheld. He finished the lesson. He closed the Bible. He looked up, and then he departed from the text. Joan Healy, he said, was a woman of faith, a woman of goodness, a wife and a daughter, and, for 9 minutes, a mother. She was taken from us not by God's will, but by the failure of human hands, hands that presumed to intervene in the sacred act of birth, hands that claimed knowledge they did not possess, hands that— He paused. The pause was deliberate. It was the pause of a man who had rehearsed this. My daughter, he said, has practiced the craft of midwifery in this village for 17 years. I have prayed for her. I have prayed for the women she attends. I have prayed that the Lord would guide her hands and forgive her presumption, but prayer has limits, and presumption has consequences. The church was silent. Hannah felt the silence like a change in air pressure, not heard but sensed, physical, pressing against the skin. My daughter kills mothers, he said it clearly, without raising his voice, with the measured authority of a man who wasn't speaking as a father but as a vicar, which amounted to the same thing and always had. Joan Healy is dead because a woman with herbs and linens and the presumption to call herself a healer was in the room instead of a physician, a trained man, a man of science, a man who might have saved her. Robert Healy, in the front pew, was staring at the coffin. He didn't react. He had heard the words, but the words had not yet reached the part of him that would decide what to do with them. Grief had a delay. Hannah knew this. She had seen it in 100 rooms. The moment when the information arrives, and the moment when the information is understood, and the gap between them is where the damage is done, because into that gap other people pour their own meaning. Bridget Healy, beside Robert, turned. She turned in the pew and looked at the back of the church where Hannah stood. The look carried everything: fury, grief, apology, solidarity. The look said, I was in the room. I saw what you did. I know. But Bridget didn't speak. You do not speak in church when the vicar is speaking. You do not contradict the man at the front. You do not stand up and say, that is not what happened, because standing up in church is not what women do. And Bridget Healy, for all her weathered stone and her broad shoulders and her hedgerow flowers, she was in a church in 1843, and the rules applied. Hannah stood. She stood at the back of the church where she had chosen to stand, because sitting would have caused a scene, and now standing was causing a different scene. The scene of someone being called a killer by her own father over the coffin of the woman she had tried to save. She didn't cry. She didn't leave. She stood and she looked at her father, and her expression was that of someone who had been waiting for this. Not surprised, not wounded, ready. She had known since the moment Joan died that her father would find a way to use it. She had known because she knew him, knew the theology that drove him, knew the certainty that sustained him, knew that Joan's death was not, for Elias Wyatt, a tragedy but a confirmation. A confirmation that his daughter's work was against God's order, that women's pain in birth was purposeful, that easing it was sin, and that Joan's death was the consequence of that sin, and Hannah was the sinner, and the church was where sins were named. She stood, and she waited for him to finish, and the church was silent, and the bell ringer who had rung 12 bells for Joan Healy's 12 years of marriage was silent too, because even he, who had liked Joan, who had chosen 12 because 12 felt right, could not speak against the vicar. No one could, except the man standing at the back of the church, 3 feet behind Hannah, who had arrived late and who had heard everything. Samuel Drayton, Duke of Harlow, hadn't intended to be at this funeral. He had intended to be at his estate in Hampshire, 40 miles east, reviewing the household accounts with his steward and avoiding the quality of silence that his house had carried since Charlotte died. Charlotte had been his wife. She had died last year in a bedroom on the 2nd floor, attended by 2 physicians and a surgeon, all of whom had been knighted, all of whom had been paid handsomely, and none of whom had saved her. Charlotte had died in childbirth. The baby, a boy, had died 3 hours later. The physicians had said it was a complication. They had used words like unavoidable and despite best efforts and the Lord's will. Samuel had accepted these words at the time because he was drowning, and drowning men do not critique the vocabulary of the people standing on the bank. Later, months later, when the drowning had receded enough for him to stand, he had asked questions. He had asked what a complication meant. He had asked what best efforts had consisted of. He had asked whether the instruments had been clean, whether the physician's hands had been washed, whether the room had been aired, whether anyone had thought to check whether the baby was turned before they opened Charlotte's body with a blade. The answers had been unsatisfactory. The answers had been evasive. The answers had contained, beneath their professional veneer, the suggestion that a duke should not question physicians and that grief was an acceptable substitute for inquiry. Samuel did not find grief an acceptable substitute for anything. He had spent the months since Charlotte's death reading, not medical texts at first. He wasn't a physician. But grief turned into questions, and questions turned into books, and books turned into an education the physicians would not have approved of. He read the midwifery manuals, the old ones, the women's ones. He read about puerperal fever and about Oliver Wendell Holmes in Boston, who had published that very year, arguing that physicians carried childbed fever from patient to patient on their unwashed hands, and who had been dismissed by the medical establishment for saying so. He read until the grief became a question. Had Charlotte needed to die? The question led him to a pamphlet. The pamphlet led him to a name. Hannah Wyatt of Thornfield Hollow, Dorset. Over 200 deliveries. A loss rate the author called remarkable. Samuel had come to meet her, to understand whether Charlotte might have lived if the hands in the room had been different. He had arrived in the village that morning. He had been told there was a funeral. He had gone to the church because funerals, in his experience, were where you learned the truth about a place, not from the eulogy, but from who sat where and who stood and who looked at whom and what was not said. He had not expected to hear a vicar call his own daughter a killer. He stood 3 feet behind her. He saw the back of her head, brown hair, dark, pinned tight, a few strands escaping at the neck. He saw her shoulders, not broad, not narrow, held still with the controlled stillness of someone absorbing a blow they expected. He saw her hands at her sides, short-fingered, strong, the knuckles reddened from washing, the hands of a woman whose work required cleanliness and who took the requirement seriously. He saw that she didn't leave. He saw that she didn't cry. He saw that she stood and listened to her father call her a killer, and that her response wasn't grief or fury, but something he recognized because he had felt it himself in the months after Charlotte, the exhausted clarity of a person who has been fighting a system so large that individual cruelty is just another brick in the wall. He didn't speak. Not yet. He stood behind her and he listened and he counted the lies in the vicar's sermon. Not the scriptural lies, which were matters of interpretation, but the medical lies, which were matters of fact. The vicar said a physician might have saved her. Samuel knew, from months of reading, from the statistics, from the midwifery manuals, from the pamphlets, from the ugly arithmetic of maternal death, that a physician almost certainly wouldn't have saved her, that the hemorrhage Joan Healy had suffered was survivable roughly 4 times in 10, regardless of who was in the room, that the midwife's interventions, the compresses, the ergot, the elevation, were exactly correct, and that a physician, arriving with unwashed hands and a set of forceps and the confidence of a university education, would have been more likely to introduce infection than to stop bleeding. The vicar didn't know this. The village didn't know this. The woman standing in front of Samuel, who did know this, who had known it her entire working life, was being called a killer for practicing medicine that was better than the medicine that would replace it. The funeral ended. The congregation filed out. They moved around Hannah like water around a stone, not touching, not acknowledging the current parting and reforming. A few women looked at her. None spoke. The vicar's word was the vicar's word, and the vicar's word was God's word, and God's word didn't require a second opinion. Hannah walked out of the church. She walked past the graveyard where Joan would be buried. She walked past the lich gate. She walked into the lane. She didn't look back. Samuel followed. "Miss Wyatt," she stopped. She didn't turn. "My name is Samuel Drayton. I came to this village to find you. I didn't expect to find you here." She turned. She looked at him. Brown eyes, dark, direct, the color of turned earth, the color of the soil she grew her herbs in. A face that wasn't pretty in the way the word was usually meant, not delicate, not symmetrical, not designed to be looked at across a ballroom. It was a face that had been outdoors in all weather for every one of her 33 years. There were lines around the eyes. There was a scar on the left hand, old, white, from a blade, the kind of scar midwives get when they cut cord in dark rooms by feel. She was shorter than he expected, 5'3", perhaps 4, hands that were built for work, not display. "You're not from this village," she said. "No, you're not a physician. No. You were standing behind me." "I was." "How much did you hear?" "All of it." She looked at him the way she looked at everything, directly, without the social softening that women of this period were expected to perform. The assessment was professional, not personal. She was reading him the way she read a room. Who is this person? What do they want? Are they dangerous? Can they help? Will they leave? "What do you want, Mr. Drayton?" "Your Grace." "I beg your pardon?" "My title. I am the Duke of Harlow, but that is not what I want. What I want is to know whether your hands were clean when Joan Healy died." The question was so unexpected, so far from anything anyone had said to her in the 3 days since Joan's death, that Hannah's professional composure cracked for half a second. The crack was small, a tightening at the corner of the mouth, a shift in the eyes from assessment to something more vulnerable, surprise, maybe, or the beginning of the feeling you get when someone asks the right question for the first time. "Yes," she said, "my hands were clean. They are always clean. I boil my water. I wash before I touch. I have done this since I was 16, and my mother taught me, and her mother taught her. The physicians do not do this. If you want to know why Joan Healy died, the answer is hemorrhage. If you want to know whether clean hands could have prevented it, the answer is no. If you want to know whether a physician could have saved her, the answer is almost certainly not. If you want to know why my father just called me a killer in front of the entire village, the answer is theology, not medicine. He believes that women's pain in childbirth is God's punishment for Eve, and that easing it is sin. I ease it, therefore I sin. And when a woman dies under my hands, it is not a tragedy, it is proof." She said all of this without raising her voice, without performing the anger, with the precision of a woman who had made this argument before, to different people, in different rooms, and who no longer expected it to matter, but who couldn't stop making it because the argument was true, and truth, unlike persuasion, does not require an audience. Samuel looked at her, at the hands that had been inside a dying woman 3 days ago, the reddened knuckles, the brown eyes that carried grief and competence and the exhausted fury of a person who was very good at a thing the world was trying to take from her. "My wife died in childbirth," he said, 14 months ago, attended by 2 physicians and a surgeon. Their hands were not clean. I didn't know to ask. I am asking now." Hannah was quiet. The road was empty. The funeral procession had moved to the graveyard. The sound of the earth hitting the coffin, the first shovelful, which is always the worst, carried across the churchyard to where they stood. "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it. She said it the way she said everything, without decoration, without performance, with the directness of someone whose work didn't allow the luxury of softening things. "The pamphlet," Samuel said. "The one by Aldridge. It cites your work. Over 200 deliveries, 12 losses in 3 generations of Wyatt women. 13 now. The London doctors have a loss rate 4 times that. I know. The physicians do not wash their hands. I know. The physicians are replacing midwives in every county in England. I know that too. And your father just called you a killer from the pulpit of a church that is now going to believe him because he is a vicar, and you are a woman. And the word of a man in a surplice has more weight than the hands of a woman with 17 years of clean births." "You've been reading," Hannah said, "for 14 months. Why?" "Because my wife is dead, and the men who were supposed to save her couldn't even be bothered to wash their hands. And I want to know, I need to know, whether she had to die, whether the complication that killed her was unavoidable, or whether it was caused by the very men who were paid to prevent it." Hannah looked at him, at the broad shoulders, the black hair, cut close, the blue eyes that carried the clarity of a man who had spent 14 months converting grief into information and who had arrived at a conclusion he could not unarrive at. The jaw set, the hands, large, clean, a duke's hands that had never delivered a baby but that had turned pages until they understood what the hands in the room should have done. "Come to my cottage," she said. "Not now, tomorrow. I have a woman at term in the next village, and I may be called tonight. Come tomorrow, and I will show you what I do. Not what the physicians say I do. Not what my father says I do. What I actually do. And then you can decide for yourself whether Joan Healy died because of my hands, or despite them. Tomorrow," he said. "Bring nothing. Touch nothing. Watch." She turned. She walked down the lane toward her cottage, the lane she had walked 1,000 times in the dark, carrying her bag because someone's wife or daughter was in labor and the midwife was needed. The midwife had always come. That was what Wyatt women did. Samuel watched her go. He stood outside the church where a man had just called his daughter a killer, and he thought, "The hands matter. The hands have always mattered. And the woman walking away from him had the right hands, and the world was trying to take them from her. He would learn. Grief is slow. Understanding is slower. But tomorrow he would watch, and the watching would change everything. The village turned, not all at once, not the way a door shuts, sudden, complete, the latch catching, the way a season turns, gradually, in degrees, so that by the time you notice you are standing in a different weather, you cannot point to the day it changed. The baker's wife crossed the street. Hannah saw it, the adjustment, the way you adjust course around a puddle or a cart, the not-looking that told Hannah everything. Within the week, Mrs. Ellis sent word through her husband that she would not require Hannah's services. The message was brief. "Mrs. Ellis will be attended by Dr. Pettigrew, Dr. Oswald Pettigrew, the physician from Dorchester, a man who had trained at Guy's Hospital in London and who had been extending his services to the surrounding villages with the quiet persistence of a man who understood that the future of obstetrics belonged to men with degrees and that the midwives were obstacles to progress. Hannah knew Pettigrew. She had met him once, at a birth that had gone wrong. Another midwife's patient, eclampsia. "I don't work with midwives," he had said. "The patient is seizing," Hannah had replied. "Do you want to discuss credentials, or do you want to help me keep her alive?" They had kept her alive. He administered the laudanum. She delivered the baby. He wrote in his report that the delivery had been conducted under medical supervision. She went home and washed her hands. Now Pettigrew was taking her patients. The vicar had spoken. The village had listened, and the women who had trusted Hannah for 17 years were choosing a man from Dorchester whose hands she had seen and whose hands she knew had not been washed. The third sign was the baby, Joan's baby. The girl, the one who had lived, the one Hannah had fed from a cloth in the kitchen while Joan's body cooled, had been with Bridget since the funeral. Robert Healy couldn't care for her. He was a man hollowed by grief, functioning at the level of a body that has not yet received the message that functioning is optional. He milked the cows. The cows needed milking. He fed the chickens. The chickens needed feeding. He didn't feed himself. He didn't speak. The baby was with Bridget because Bridget was the only person in the family who was still fully present, and Bridget was 61, and her hands shook, and she could not manage a newborn alone. Hannah helped. She came every day, in the early morning, before the village was awake enough to notice, and she fed the baby, and checked the baby, and showed Bridget how to prepare the milk mixture and how to wind the baby and how to recognize the signs of colic and jaundice and the 100 small crises that newborns produce in their first weeks. She did this. The baby needed it. Hannah was a midwife, and the midwife's job didn't end at the birth. It ended when the baby was safe, and this baby wasn't yet safe. On the 7th day, Robert Healy came to the door of his mother's cottage while Hannah was feeding the baby. He stood in the doorway. He looked at Hannah. He looked at the baby. He looked at Hannah's hands. The square hands, the short nails, the scar, holding his daughter. "Get out," he said. Bridget stood. "Robert!" "Get her out. She killed Joan. She's not touching my daughter." Hannah set the baby down in the cradle. She set her down carefully, supporting the head, the way she had set down over 200 babies, the way her hands did it automatically, the way her hands would always do it, because hands remember what the mind sometimes forgets. "The baby needs feeding every 3 hours," Hannah said. "The milk should be warm, not hot. Test it on your wrist. If she vomits after feeding, hold her upright for 20 minutes. If the cord stump weeps, apply honey, not sugar honey. If she develops a fever, send for me." "I won't send for you." "Send for me anyway. A fever in the first month can kill in hours. Your grief is yours, Mr. Healy. Your daughter's life is not." She picked up her leather bag. She walked past him. He didn't move from the doorway, so she turned sideways to pass, and for a moment they were close enough that she could smell the grief on him. Unwashed clothes, stale beer, the sour exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept properly since his wife died. She didn't judge this. She had smelled grief before. It had a particular scent, not the grief itself, but the things grief makes people stop doing. The washing, the eating, the maintenance of the body that continues when the reason for maintaining it has been removed. She walked home. The walk was longer now, not in distance, in the weight of it. One side had a pulpit, the other had a bag and clean hands. She sat in her kitchen. She didn't cry. She had cried for Joan. Alone, the crying midwives do in private because the work requires a face that doesn't show the cost. She had stopped because crying used energy she couldn't afford to waste. The knock came at her door the following morning. She opened it expecting Bridget. She found Samuel Drayton, Duke of Harlow, standing on her doorstep with a journal and the expression of a man who had driven 40 miles to see something and intended to see it. "You said tomorrow," he said. "It's tomorrow." "I said bring nothing." She looked at the notebook. "This is months of questions. I'm willing to negotiate. You're standing on my doorstep." "Your doorstep is outside. I haven't entered your cottage. I've brought a notebook, which is not nothing, I concede, but I haven't yet watched, which is the part I came for." She almost smiled, not quite, but the muscles moved in the direction of the smile without arriving at it, which was the closest Hannah Wyatt came to amusement in the presence of strangers. "Come in," she said. "Don't touch the penny-royal." "If you are still listening, if you are here in the lane with the hedgerows and the woman whose own father called her a killer at a funeral, thank you. You stayed, and if you are new here, welcome. This is Duke of Hearts Romance. We tell stories about women the world underestimated. You are in the right place. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. What comes next is the part where she shows him what her hands can do, not even close to finished. Now, back to Thornfield Hollow. She showed him the still room first. It was a small room at the back of the cottage, whitewashed walls, a stone floor she scrubbed with lye every week, shelves lined with jars, each labeled in her mother's handwriting: ergot, calendula, comfrey, root, raspberry leaf, chamomile, lavender oil, a work table in the center, scrubbed smooth, a set of instruments in a leather roll, scissors, clamps, a curved needle, thread boiled in salt water. The leather bag with the brass clasp, packed and ready by the door, because a midwife's bag was always packed, because babies didn't wait for preparation. "This is where I work when I'm not at a birth," she said. "The herbs are grown in my garden. The instruments are cleaned after every use, boiled for 20 minutes in water. The linens are washed and dried in sunlight. The bag is packed with everything I need for a standard delivery and a difficult one," Samuel wrote. He wrote quickly in a small, precise hand, the handwriting of a man who had spent 14 months writing and who had developed the efficiency of a man who knew that the next piece of information was coming and he needed to be ready for it. "The physicians," he said, "they don't boil their instruments. No, they don't wash their hands. Most don't. Some are beginning to. Oliver Wendell Holmes in Boston has published this year arguing that physicians carry puerperal fever from patient to patient on their hands. He has been ridiculed for it. You wash your hands. Before every examination, after every examination, between patients, after handling linens, after handling instruments. My mother taught me. Her mother taught her. Wyatt women have washed their hands for 3 generations. We didn't need a Viennese physician to tell us that dirty hands kill women. We knew because we counted. Counted the deaths. My grandmother kept a ledger. My mother continued it. I continue it. Every birth, every outcome, every intervention, every loss. 3 generations, 614 births, 13 losses. The doctors do not keep ledgers, they keep accounts. They know how much they charge. They do not know how many they lose." Samuel stopped writing. He looked at her. She was standing beside the work table with her hands at her sides, the square hands, the scar, the short nails, and she was giving him information the way she gave everything, directly, without cushioning, with the expectation that the person receiving it was capable of handling it. "May I see the ledger?" he said. She brought it. A thick book, bound in brown leather, the pages soft with use. The first entries were in a handwriting he didn't recognize, the grandmother's. Clear, practical. Patient name, date, presentation, interventions, outcome. Then the mother's handwriting, similar but slightly finer. Then Hannah's, smaller, more precise, with a column the other 2 had not used. Hands washed. Every entry in Hannah's section had a mark in this column. Every one. He turned to the last entry. Joan Healy. Date, July 14th, 1843. Presentation, normal vertex. Labor, 11 hours. Delivery, clean, uncomplicated. Baby, female, 7 pounds, healthy. Postpartum, hemorrhage at 9 minutes. Intervention, compress, elevation, ergot, tincture. Outcome, maternal death at 5:11 a.m. Cause, uterine rupture, uncontrollable hemorrhage. Hands washed, yes. Below the entry, in Hannah's handwriting, smaller, the ink slightly smudged. I could not save her. The tear was internal, no intervention available. The baby lived. Samuel closed the ledger. Your father said a physician might have saved her. My father has never attended a birth. He has never seen a hemorrhage. He has never held a woman's hand while she bled and known with certainty, known with 17 years of knowledge, that the bleeding wouldn't stop and that the woman would die, and that the best he could do was hold her hand and make sure she was not alone. My father has read one book his entire life, and it tells him that suffering is purposeful. He does not need to understand hemorrhage because hemorrhage, for him, is God's vocabulary. And for you? It is a medical event with physiological causes. Some can be managed, some cannot. Jones couldn't. I made every correct decision. I used every available intervention. She died anyway. That is not murder. That is the limit of what hands can do. Samuel looked at the ledger. At the 3 generations of handwriting, at the 614 entries, at the column that said hands washed, and that represented, in its quiet, obsessive way, the difference between a tradition that saved lives and a profession that was replacing it with unwashed confidence. I'd like to stay, he said, in the village, for a time. I have questions that this ledger begins to answer but does not finish. I'd like to understand your methods. I'd like to observe, with your permission, a birth. And I'd like to understand why the system that killed my wife is being allowed to replace the system that has kept women in this village alive for 3 generations. You want to watch a birth? With your permission and the mother's consent. You're a duke. I'm aware of that. Dukes do not attend village births. This one does. Hannah looked at him, at the journal full of months of questions, at the blue eyes that held grief and intelligence and the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided to understand something and who would not be dissuaded by convention or propriety, or the fact that dukes do not, as a rule, spend their time in the cottages of Dorset midwives watching women give birth. "There's a woman in the next village," Hannah said. "Mrs. Cartwright, 6th child, due in 3 weeks. Her births are fast and clean. If she consents, you may observe. You will stand in the corner. You will not speak. You will not faint. I don't not touch. You will not faint. I don't faint. Every man says that. Most men faint. I held my wife's hand while she died. I didn't faint." Hannah paused. The pause held something, not sympathy, which she dispensed sparingly, but recognition. The recognition of one person who had been in a room where death was present, acknowledging another. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'll send word to Mrs. Cartwright. You can come to the birth if she agrees. In the meantime, you can read the ledger, all 3 generations. Start with my grandmother. She had the best penmanship." The days developed a pattern. Samuel came each morning. He read the ledger. He asked questions. Hannah answered them, briefly, precisely, without unnecessary gentleness. She taught the way she midwifed, with clean hands and no softening. He learned about ergot, the doses measured in grains, too little doing nothing, too much causing convulsions. He learned about presentation, how Hannah's hands could feel through the belly and know which way the baby was lying. She showed him on a flour sack stuffed with rags, a turnip for the baby's head. He wrote in his journal, "She reads the baby through the belly, the way a sailor reads the wind." And he learned about Hannah, not through questions. She deflected those. He asked about her father. She said, "The comfrey is ready to harvest." He asked about her mother. She said, "The comfrey, now." He asked about Joan, and she stopped moving and looked at him and said, "Ask me about my methods. Do not ask me about my losses." He learned anyway. She hummed when she worked, a low, tuneless rhythm. She talked to her herbs. "You're going to seed too early," she told the calendula. "Stop it." She kept a cat, a gray, one-eared animal that lived in the still-room and that Hannah called the bishop, because, she said, he sits in the warmest spot and judges everyone. Samuel watched her hands. He told himself it was for the report. All of that was true. But there was another reason, and it was simpler and more complicated, and he didn't write it in his journal because some things resist being written down. Hannah noticed. She noticed everything. She didn't comment. Instead, she said, "The bishop is sitting on your journal." "I know. He does that when he disapproves of the visitor." "And when he approves?" "He has never approved of a visitor. Don't take it personally." Samuel looked at the bishop. The bishop looked at Samuel. The cat yawned, a slow, deliberate yawn, the yawn of an animal who has assessed a person and found them tolerable but not interesting. And then he lay down on the journal and closed his eye. "I think he approves," Samuel said. "That's not approval. That's contempt, performed as a favor. He's warming your journal. He considers this a service." "Is it?" "The bishop considers everything he does a service. This is what happens when you name a cat after a clergyman. he develops a theology of entitlement. Samuel almost smiled. The almost was a thing he had noticed about himself in the weeks since he had come to Thornfield Hollow. The almost smiles, the moments where something in his chest moved in a direction it hadn't moved since Charlotte. He didn't name it. Too soon. But the direction was real, and it pointed at a woman in a work apron who talked to calendula and named her cat after a bishop, and who had the best hands he had ever seen, and who was being destroyed for using them. Mrs. Cartwright's labor began on a Thursday at 2 in the morning. Hannah was already awake. She had been awake since midnight, sitting in her kitchen with a cup of cold tea and the leather bag by the door, because she had checked Mrs. Cartwright that afternoon, and she had felt, through the belly, through those square hands, that the baby had dropped and that the birth was close. Close, for a sixth child, meant hours, not days. The knock came at 2:10. Mr. Cartwright, a large man, a carpenter, with hands bigger than Hannah's, and a face that held the terror of a man who has been through 5 births, and who knows that every one is a new opportunity for disaster. "She's started," he said. "I know. I've been waiting. Go home, boil water, find clean linen. I'll be there in 10 minutes. She was there in 8. She sent word to Samuel, a note carried by the boy who lived next door, who was 13, and who considered being the midwife's messenger the most important job in the village. Samuel arrived at the Cartwright cottage at 2:20. He stood in the doorway. He looked at Hannah, who was already beside Mrs. Cartwright, already assessing, already working. "Corner," Hannah said. "Don't speak, don't touch, don't faint." He went to the corner. He stood. He watched. What he saw over the next 4 hours he would later describe in his journal as the most competent medical practice I have observed in any setting, conducted by a woman with no degree, no hospital appointment, no professional recognition, and no legal standing, in a cottage in Dorset at 3 in the morning by candlelight. He watched her wash her hands 3 times, each time with water she had brought herself, boiled and cooled and carried in a sealed jar. He watched her examine Mrs. Cartwright with precision, her hands reading the belly like a map. He watched her talk to Mrs. Cartwright in the direct, honest tone of one professional to another. "You're at 6 fingers. The baby is vertex. This will take another 2 hours. The pain will get worse before it gets better. I'm here." He watched her move Mrs. Cartwright from the bed to a squat, because gravity assisted delivery and the bed didn't, and the doctors insisted on the bed because the bed was easier for the physician, not because it was better for the woman. He watched her catch the baby. At 6:07 in the morning, a boy, 8 pounds. The cry immediate, furious, the sound of a healthy child entering the world and objecting to the temperature. He watched her hands, the way they held the baby, secure, practiced, the 1,000-repetition confidence of a woman who had caught babies for 17 years and who held each one as though it were the first, the way she checked the baby, the breathing, the color, the cord, the way she cut the cord, 1 stroke, clean, the blade angled, the way she placed the baby on Mrs. Cartwright's chest and said, "He's here, he's well, you did the work." He watched her deliver the afterbirth. He watched her check for tearing. He watched her clean Mrs. Cartwright with the same boiled water, the same fresh linens, the same methodical care. He watched her wash her hands again, the 4th time, and check the baby again and check Mrs. Cartwright again, and only then, when everything was clean and safe and accounted for, did she sit on the stool by the fire and close her eyes for 3 seconds. 3 seconds. Then her eyes opened, and her hands were moving again, because the work wasn't done until the mother was safe and the baby was fed. and the room was clean. The carpenter was weeping in the doorway, not from grief, but from relief, the weeping men do when terror has been replaced by a boy with furious lungs and a face that looked, Mr. Cartwright said through the tears, exactly like his grandmother. Samuel stood in the corner. He had not spoken. He hadn't fainted. He wrote one word in his journal, underlined it 3 times. The word was alive. The following Tuesday, Samuel arrived at the cottage carrying a wooden case. He set it on the work table in the still room without ceremony. "Open it," he said. Hannah opened it. Inside, packed in straw, 3 glass bottles of laudanum. Medical grade, tincture of opium. The labels from a London supplier, the kind of supplier who sold to hospitals and physicians and who did not, as a rule, sell to village midwives because the concentrated tincture required a physician's order. "How did you get this?" she said. "I wrote to the supplier. I used my title. I told him it was for my household physician." "You don't have a household physician." "I have a household midwife. The supplier didn't ask for clarification." Hannah held one of the bottles. She held it the way she held her instruments, with the careful attention of a woman who understood what it could do. Laudanum could ease a woman's agony in the worst hours of a difficult labor. It could buy time during a prolonged birth. It could prevent the kind of exhaustion that killed women in the 2nd day of labor. Hannah could grow poppies, but could not obtain the concentrated tincture. The apothecary would not sell it to a woman without a physician's order, and no physician would write an order for a midwife. She set the bottle down. She didn't thank him. She adjusted the bottles in the case so they wouldn't clink. She closed the lid. She placed the case on the shelf beside the ergot and the calendula and the comfrey root. "You understand," she said, "that if the apothecary discovers where this went, there will be questions. I understand that if you don't have this, women will suffer longer than they need to. The questions are a social problem. The suffering is a medical one. I know which one weighs more." She looked at him, at the blue eyes that had been watching her hands for weeks, and that were now watching her face with something she hadn't seen in them before. Not admiration, which she didn't need, but partnership. The look of a man who had decided that the fight was shared and who had brought ammunition. "Don't tell the bishop," she said. "He'll want his own supply." He stayed. The pattern held, the questions, the still room, the ledger when needed, the herbs, the cat on his journal. The village noticed. A duke visiting the midwife the vicar had called a killer. The calculation was simple. One of them was wrong. But the constant was shifting. The Duke had been at the Cartwright birth. Mrs. Cartwright was alive. The baby was alive. And Mr. Cartwright was telling anyone who would listen that Hannah Wyatt's hands were the steadiest thing he had ever seen at 3 in the morning, and that the Duke had been there and had watched, and that whatever he wrote in his journal, it was the truth. And Bridget Healy was talking too, not from a pulpit, at the market, at the well, in the lane, in the quiet, persistent way that women share truth when the official channels are closed to them. "I was in the room," Bridget said, to the baker's wife, to Mrs. Ellis, to anyone who would listen. "I watched her fight for my daughter for 47 minutes, and when it was over, she washed Joan's face and wrapped her in a clean sheet and held the baby and fed the baby and sat in the chair until I came. She didn't leave. She could have left. She stayed." The village listened. Not all of it. Not yet. But the calculation was shifting because the vicar had spoken from a church, and Bridget Healy was speaking from a kitchen, and the kitchen in a village is where the truth lives. Samuel came to the cottage on a Wednesday morning and found Hannah in the garden, kneeling in the soil, pulling weeds from around the Rosemary, with the focused aggression of a woman who was angry at something that wasn't Rosemary. "Pettigrew has taken 2 more patients," she said. She didn't look up. "Mrs. Foster and Mrs. Crane, both due in the autumn, both mine. I've attended them through their pregnancies. Both switched to Pettigrew this week." Samuel sat on the garden wall. He didn't speak. He knew, after weeks of mornings, that Hannah's silences were more informative than most people's speeches, and that waiting was more useful than asking. "He doesn't wash his hands," she said. "I've seen his instruments. He carries them in a case that hasn't been cleaned since he bought it. He comes from Dorchester, where he treats wounds and infections and God knows what else, and he goes directly to a woman in labor, and he puts his hands inside her without washing, and he calls it medicine. And I, who boil my water and scrub my floor and wash 4 times per birth, I am the one who kills mothers." She pulled a weed. The weed resisted. She pulled harder. "The irony," she said, "is that Pettigrew will prove my father right, not because he is correct that women should suffer, but because Pettigrew's hands will do what my father says my hands do. Pettigrew will carry infection from his surgery to the birthing room, and women will die, and the village will say, 'See, birth is dangerous,' and they will not say, 'See, the doctor didn't wash his hands,' because the doctor has a degree, and a degree is a kind of cleanliness that has nothing to do with actual cleanliness." Samuel closed his journal. "The Holmes data," he said. "Holmes documents case after case. Physicians who went from autopsy to delivery without washing, and every woman they touched died of childbed fever. The midwives who washed lost almost none. You have been right your entire career, and the system that should be learning from you is replacing you because the system wasn't built to learn from women. I know all of this. I know. You know it. I'm telling you that I know it too. And I am telling you, as a duke, as a magistrate, as a man who lost his wife to the system that is destroying you, that I am going to do something about it." Hannah looked at him. She was still kneeling in the soil. The rosemary was behind her. The bishop was watching from the still-room window with the expression of a cat who has heard promises before and is reserving judgment. "What are you going to do?" "I am going to write a report to the College of Physicians, documenting your methods, your outcomes, your ledger, the Wyatt midwifery practice. I am going to cite the Holmes data. I am going to cite Aldrich's pamphlet. I am going to cite the Cartwright birth, which I witnessed. And I am going to argue that the displacement of traditional midwives by physicians who do not wash their hands is not progress. It is a public health catastrophe. A report. Yes. To the College of Physicians. Yes. Written by a duke. Written by a duke who watched a birth and who read a ledger and who can count. The arithmetic is not complicated, Hannah. 614 births, 13 losses. The physicians cannot touch that number. The College of Physicians will see it. It was the first time he had called her Hannah, not Miss Wyatt. Hannah, she noticed. She did not comment on it. She pulled another weed. "And my father? Your father is a vicar who has confused theology with medicine. The College of Physicians does not answer to the pulpit. The law does not answer to the pulpit. And the coroner, when I request a formal inquest into Joan Healy's death, which I intend to do, will not answer to the pulpit either. A coroner's inquest. To establish the cause of death formally, to clear your name officially, to put on record that Joan Healy died of a uterine rupture that no intervention, physician, midwife, or divine, could have prevented." Hannah stood. The soil fell from her apron. She was shorter than he remembered, shorter every time he saw her, which was the opposite of what he expected, because in his mind she was growing larger with every conversation, and in reality she was 5 feet 3, and covered in garden soil, and looking at him with brown eyes that held something he had not seen in them before. Hope, small, fragile, the kind of hope that lives in people who have stopped expecting it and who are unprepared for its return. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't promise me something you can't deliver. A report is paper. A coroner's inquest is a man in a room. My father has 32 years and a God who agrees with him. Paper does not outweigh God, not in Thornfield Hollow. They might. And if they don't, I will have lost not just my reputation, but the hope that it could be restored. Losing hope after you've rebuilt it is worse than never having it. I've done it before. When my mother died, the village accepted me. Then Joan died, and my father spoke, and I lost it again. I cannot lose it a third time." Samuel looked at her, at the square hands with the soil, at the scar, at the brown eyes holding hope they didn't trust. "I am not promising you hope," he said. "I am promising you arithmetic. The numbers are on your side. The evidence is on your side. The dead women in London hospitals whose physicians didn't wash their hands. They are on your side. I cannot promise that the arithmetic will win. I can promise that it will be heard." Hannah pulled the last weed. She dropped it in the bucket. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Fine," she said. "Write your report. Request your inquest. Do your arithmetic. I'll keep washing my hands and delivering babies and talking to Rosemary and waiting for the world to notice that clean hands save lives and dirty ones end them." She paused. "And Samuel?" It was the first time she had used his name. Not "Your Grace." "Samuel," he noticed. "Your wife," she said. "The physicians who attended her. Their hands." "I know. You've always known." "I've known since the 2nd month. I couldn't say it for 12 more. It wasn't your fault." "I know that too." "Knowing it and believing it are different distances. I'm still walking." She nodded. She picked up the weed bucket. She walked to the compost heap at the back of the garden. The bishop followed her. The compost heap was where the mice lived, and the bishop considered pest control part of his ecclesiastical duties. Samuel sat on the garden wall and wrote in his journal. He did not write about the report, or the inquest, or the College of Physicians. He wrote, "She said my name. The rosemary is in bloom. The cat is hunting. I am still walking. The distance is shorter than it was." The crisis came in September. Mrs. Foster, who had left Hannah for Pettigrew, went into labor on a Tuesday evening. Her husband sent for Pettigrew. Pettigrew came from Dorchester. He arrived at 9 o'clock, 3 hours after the labor had begun, in a coat that smelled of the surgery, and with hands he didn't wash. Hannah was at home, mending the leather bag. The clasp had worn through, and she was sewing a new one, because a clasp that failed at 2 in the morning on a dark road wasn't an inconvenience but a danger. The knock came at 11. Mr. Foster, white-faced. The terror in his eyes was the kind that meant something had gone wrong. "She's bleeding," he said. "The doctor, he can't stop it. He said to get anyone. He said to get help. He said to get me. He said to get anyone. He meant me." Hannah picked up the bag. The new clasp held. She walked with Mr. Foster through the dark, the lane, the hedgerows, the blackthorn catching at her skirt. And she entered the Foster cottage, and she saw the room, and she understood. Mrs. Foster was in the bed. The sheets were soaked. The blood was the wrong color, dark, not bright, and the smell in the room was the smell. Hannah knew, the smell of a birth that had become a disaster. Pettigrew was at the foot of the bed. His coat was still on. His hands, unwashed, The hands that had come from the surgery in Dorchester were reaching into his instrument case for the forceps. He was going to cut. He was going to open this woman up in a cottage with unsterilized instruments, because cutting was the only response his training had given him for a situation his training had not prepared him for. "Stop," Hannah said from the doorway. He looked up. His face was the face of a man who had reached the limit of his training and who had discovered, at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in a cottage in Dorset, that the limit wasn't where he thought it was. "Miss Wyatt," he said, "put down the forceps. Move." He moved. Hannah went to Mrs. Foster. She assessed. The blood, the color, the flow. Her hands, washed, always washed. She had washed them before she left the cottage out of habit, and the habit saved lives, went to Mrs. Foster's belly. She felt. She read. "The placenta has detached," she said. "Partially. The baby is still inside. The baby is alive. I can feel the heartbeat through the wall. The bleeding is from the detachment, not from a tear. This is manageable. This is not Joan." She said the last 3 words to herself, but the room heard them. "I need boiling water," she said. "Clean linen, all of it. Every clean cloth in this house. And I need him," she pointed at Pettigrew, "to wash his hands, now, in the boiled water, before he touches anything else in this room." Pettigrew's face shifted. The shift was small, a tightening at the mouth, the face of a man whose professional dignity has been challenged by a woman with a leather bag in a cottage at 11 at night. "My hands are perfectly. Your hands came straight from treating open wounds. You did not wash them when you arrived. You have examined this woman with hands that carry whatever was on them when you left Dorchester. If this woman develops a fever in the next 3 days, it will not be because of the detachment. It will be because of your hands. Wash them, now, or leave this room." He washed them. Not from belief. The woman in the bed was bleeding, and the midwife was the only person in the room who seemed to know what to do, and the alternative to obeying was standing at the foot of the bed with dirty hands and watching someone die. Hannah worked. She worked for 2 hours. She managed the bleeding, compresses, pressure, the tincture from her bag, doses precise, timing exact. She talked to Mrs. Foster, not in soothing tones, but in the direct, calm voice of a professional. "The baby is alive. The bleeding is slowing. I need you to stay with me. I need you to breathe. I need you to push when I tell you to push, and stop when I tell you to stop." Mrs. Foster pushed. Mrs. Foster stopped. Mrs. Foster pushed again. At 14 minutes past 1 in the morning, the baby was born, a girl. Small, 6 pounds, the cry thin but present, alive. Hannah caught her. She checked her. She cut the cord. She placed the baby on Mrs. Foster's chest. She delivered the placenta, the detached placenta, the thing that had caused the bleeding, the thing that would have killed Mrs. Foster if no one had managed it. She checked for tearing. She cleaned. Mrs. Foster was alive. The baby was alive. Pettigrew was standing in the corner. He hadn't spoken in 2 hours. He had watched. He had seen the hands, the clean hands, the hands that measured ergot in grains and felt heartbeats through bellies and caught babies with the confidence of years of deliveries, and that had saved tonight the woman he had nearly killed. Hannah turned to him. "The detachment was a complication," she said. "It happens in approximately 1 in 200 births. It requires immediate intervention, pressure, ergot, controlled delivery. It does not require a surgeon. It does not require forceps. It does not require a man who has not washed his hands. What it requires is a person who can feel the placenta through the wall and who knows the difference between detachment and rupture and who can measure ergot to the grain. You cannot do these things. I can. This is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of outcomes. She picked up the bag. The clasp held. If Mrs. Foster develops a fever, she said, send for me. Not because I can cure puerperal fever. No one can, not reliably. But because I will know what caused it. And so will you. She walked out. Into the dark, the lane, the hedgerows, the stars visible through gaps in the blackthorn where the branches didn't quite meet. Samuel was waiting at her cottage gate. He didn't know why he was there. He had been at the inn, he had heard the commotion, he had seen Mr. Foster running, and he had walked to Hannah's cottage and stood at the gate. His feet had taken him there, and his feet, it turned out, knew things. His mind hadn't yet articulated. Mrs. Foster? He said. Alive. The baby is alive. Pettigrew nearly killed them both. What happened? Placental detachment. Pettigrew's hands were unwashed. He panicked. He sent for me because he had no choice. I managed the bleeding. I delivered the baby. I told him to wash his hands. He did. The woman is alive because I was in the room. She will be alive tomorrow because I told Pettigrew to wash. She stopped at the gate. She was tired. Not the ordinary tiredness of a late night, but the deep, structural tiredness of a woman who has been fighting for so long that the fighting has become the architecture of her days, and the days without fighting feel unfinished. I'm tired, she said. She didn't say this to people. She said it to him. She wasn't sure why. I know, he said. Not of the work, never of the work. Of the fighting, of having to prove every time that my hands are good enough, that my knowledge is real, that the lives I've saved count, that the 13 I've lost are not the sum of me. I am tired of being measured by my losses when the physicians are not measured at all. Samuel opened the gate for her. She walked through. He didn't follow. The gate was the boundary. The cottage was hers. The boundary was respected. The report is almost finished, he said. I've written to the College of Physicians, and I've submitted the request for a coroner's inquest into Joan Healy's death. The inquest will be held in the village. The coroner is a man I know, impartial, thorough, interested in evidence. When? 3 weeks. Another 3 weeks. The last 3 weeks. She looked at him through the gate. The lane light was behind him. His face was in shadow, but his eyes, the blue eyes that had spent weeks watching her hands and reading her ledger and writing in the journal the cat sat on, were visible. They held the thing that she had noticed accumulating in him over the weeks, the thing she had tried not to name, because naming it would make it real, and real things could be lost. Thank you, she said, for the gate. You could have opened it yourself. I know, that's why the thank you is for the gate and not for the opening. She went inside. She sat in the kitchen. The bishop jumped onto her lap. She held him, the warm weight, the purring, the one-eared head pressing into her palm, and she allowed herself, for 3 seconds, to think about the man at the gate who opened gates. He didn't need to open and watched hands. He couldn't stop watching. And who was? She understood now, not just here for the report. 3 seconds. Then she stood. The ergot needed restocking, and the linens needed washing, and Mrs. Foster would need checking in the morning, and the work continued, as the work always continued, regardless of gates and blue eyes and the particular quality of a man who waited at a fence at midnight because his feet knew things his mind hadn't yet said. The coroner's inquest was held in the village hall on the 14th of October. The room was full. The village came, all of them, because an inquest was an event, and events were rare, and the midwife's reputation was the subject, and reputations were the currency of village life. They sat on benches and stood along the walls, and the room carried the quality of attention that belongs to rooms where something is about to be decided. The coroner was a man named Mr. Alderton, 60, lean, no nonsense. He had the face of a man who had seen enough death to be unimpressed by it and enough testimony to know when it was honest. He called Hannah first. She stood. She wasn't dressed for the occasion. She wore her work dress, the dark one, the one she wore to births, because she had come from a birth that morning. Mrs. Crane, who had switched to Pettigrew, but who had switched back after Mrs. Foster's story spread through the village, and whose baby, a boy, had been born at 6 a.m., with Hannah's clean hands and no complications. She told the room what happened, every detail, the labor, the delivery, the hemorrhage at 9 minutes, the compresses, the ergot, the 47 minutes of trying, the moment she knew the bleeding wouldn't stop, the moment Joan died. She told it the way the ledger recorded it, facts, interventions, outcomes, the column that said, "Hands washed, yes." "You could not save her," the coroner said. "No, the tear was internal, a uterine rupture. No intervention available to any practitioner, midwife, physician, or surgeon, could have altered the outcome. I made every correct decision. I used every available technique. Joan Healy died because the human body is imperfect and because some births produce injuries that cannot be repaired. That is not murder. That is not negligence. That is the limit of medicine. And if a physician had been present? A physician would have had access to laudanum, which I could not easily obtain. Laudanum would not have stopped the hemorrhage. A physician would have had access to surgical instruments. Surgery on a uterine rupture in a cottage in 1843 would have resulted in the same outcome with the addition of infection from unsterilized instruments. A physician might have attempted a surgical repair. The survival rate for emergency uterine surgery outside a hospital is less than 5%. My interventions, compress, elevation, ergot, gave Joan the best chance available. The chance wasn't enough, the coroner wrote. The room was quiet. Hannah stood with her hands at her sides, the hands at her sides, and the room looked at them, and some of them saw a killer, and some of them saw a midwife, and the difference between the two was not in the hands, but in the eyes of the person looking. Bridget Healy was called next. She stood. She was small and broad, and she walked to the front of the room with the stride of a woman who had waited 3 months to speak and who wasn't going to waste the opportunity. "I was in the room," she said, "from the first contraction to the last breath. I watched Hannah Wyatt fight for my daughter's life. Nearly an hour. I watched her use every technique she had. I watched her hands. Her clean hands, always clean, she washed before she touched Joan, and she washed after. I watched her hands try to stop the bleeding, and I watched the bleeding not stop. And I watched her, when it was over, wash my daughter's face and wrap her in a clean sheet and hold my granddaughter and feed my granddaughter because my daughter was dead and the baby was alive, and someone had to choose the living. Hannah chose the living. That is not murder. That is midwifery." She paused. She looked at the room. She looked at the vicar, who was sitting in the second row, with his hands folded and his face held in the expression of a man who has been in the room where his authority is being tested and who is not accustomed to the testing. "My son-in-law," Bridget said, "was not in the room. The vicar wasn't in the room. Dr. Pettigrew was not in the room. The women who crossed the street when Hannah walked past were not in the room. I was in the room, and I am telling you, under oath, before God and this coroner and this village, that Hannah Wyatt did not kill my daughter. My daughter died. There is a difference. And if the men in this village cannot see the difference, the women can." She sat down. Samuel was called. He stood. He was the Duke of Harlow. The room noticed. A duke giving testimony at a village inquest wasn't a thing that happened in Thornfield Hollow. The room adjusted its attention. He presented the evidence, the ledger, the Holmes data, the Cartwright birth he had witnessed, the foster birth Hannah had saved after Pettigrew's unwashed hands had nearly caused a catastrophe. "Miss Wyatt's outcomes are superior to those of the physicians replacing her," he said. "Her practice of hand-washing is consistent with the best available evidence. The accusation against her is not medical. It is personal. And it is wrong." Dr. Pettigrew was called. He stood. He was less certain than he had been 3 months ago. The foster birth had dented something in him. Not his confidence, which was structural, but the surface of his confidence, which had developed a crack through which doubt was beginning to seep. "Miss Wyatt's intervention in the foster case," he said carefully, "was effective. Her management of the placental detachment was appropriate. I would note that—" "Dr. Pettigrew," the coroner said, "were your hands washed when you attended Mrs. Foster?" A pause. "I had come directly from my surgery." "That is not what I asked. Were your hands washed?" "They were washed when Miss Wyatt instructed me to wash them." "Before that?" "No." The room heard this. The room understood it. The baker's wife, who had crossed the street, who had avoided Hannah for 3 months, looked at her own hands and then looked at Hannah's hands, and the looking was the beginning of a recalculation. The Reverend Elias Wyatt was not called. He wasn't required to testify, but he was present in the second row, and when the coroner delivered his verdict that Joan Healy had died of a uterine rupture, that the death was a natural consequence of childbirth, that no evidence of negligence or wrongdoing had been found, and that the midwife had performed her duties with exemplary competence, the vicar's face wore the expression of a man who has heard the sound of a wall beginning to crack, and who understands that the crack will not be repaired. He didn't speak to Hannah after the inquest. He left the village hall. He walked to the church. He went inside and closed the door. Hannah walked out of the village hall into the October sunlight. The village was waiting. Not all of them. Not the men who had gone to the pub, because pubs were where men went when they needed to discuss things without committing to an opinion. But the women were waiting. The baker's wife was first. She walked directly to Hannah and said, "My boy, the one you delivered, he's well. I should have said that months ago." Mrs. Ellis, Mrs. Crane, Mrs. Cartwright, one by one. The women who had heard Bridget say, "The women can," and who understood that the speaking was harder than the silence, and who were, one by one, choosing the harder thing. Hannah stood in the sunlight, and the women came, and the coming wasn't a celebration. It was a correction. The village correcting itself, the way a river corrects after a blockage, not dramatically, not with a flood, but with the slow, persistent return to the channel it had always followed. Hannah Wyatt was the channel. The village was the water. And the blockage, the vicar's sermon, the Sunday certainty, the theology that said women's pain was purpose, was cracking and the water was moving, and Hannah stood in the sunlight and felt the movement and did not cry because she wasn't built for public crying, but she held her hands together, the hands that had done everything, and she pressed them against each other the way she pressed them against solid things, because the feeling was real, and real things required contact. Samuel was beside her. He had come from the village hall. He stood beside her the way he had stood at the gate, not too close, not imposing, present. "The coroner's verdict is on record," he said. "Your name is cleared, officially. Officially. The word matters. The word is paper. Bridget's words were the ones that mattered, and Mrs. Cartwright's husband, and Mrs. Foster being alive. The paper confirms what the village already knew and was too afraid to say. The paper makes it permanent. Permanent. She said it the way she said medical terms, testing the word, assessing it, deciding whether it was accurate. Is anything permanent? Some things. Name. 1. Your hands, what they know, the way they work. That's permanent. Hannah looked at her hands. The square hands, the scar from a blade in a dark room, the short nails, the reddened knuckles from washing, the hands that had caught 217 babies and lost 13 and saved Mrs. Foster and been called cursed by her own father, and that were, tonight, clean and empty and holding nothing except each other. "Would you like to come in?" she said. "I have tea. The bishop has vacated your chair. I believe this is his version of a formal invitation." "I thought the bishop didn't approve of visitors." "He doesn't, but he has vacated the chair. For the bishop, this is the equivalent of a 21-gun salute." Samuel followed her through the gate, through the garden, into the cottage, into the kitchen where the herb jars lined the shelves and the leather bag sat by the door, and the bishop was, indeed, sitting on the floor beside the chair instead of on it, which was, Hannah confirmed, unprecedented. They sat. They drank tea. They didn't talk about the gate or the name or the hands, but when Hannah reached for the teapot, Samuel's hand was on it too. Their hands met on the ceramic, his broad, clean, hers square, scarred, the teapot between them, the kitchen quiet, the cat watching from the floor with the look of a cat who considers this a natural consequence of vacating a chair. "I have been watching your hands for weeks," he said. "I told myself it was for the report." "I know. It wasn't entirely for the report." "I know that too. I am not good at this. Charlotte made things easy. She told me what I was feeling before I knew I was feeling it. I don't have that anymore. I have a journal and 14 months of grief and a cat who has just performed an unprecedented act of hospitality, and I am sitting in a kitchen in Dorset with a woman whose hands I can't stop watching, and I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything." "That's worse." "Why?" "Because the silence fills with all the things I'm not saying, and the things I'm not saying are louder than the things I am." Hannah took her hand off the teapot. She placed it on the table. Palm up, open, the square hand, the scar, the short nails, the reddened knuckles, the hand that had caught 217 babies and that was now lying on a table in a kitchen, open, waiting. "I'm not Charlotte," she said. "I will not tell you what you're feeling. I will not make it easy. I am a midwife and I deal in facts, and the fact is that you have been coming to this cottage every morning for 6 weeks, and you have been watching my hands, and I have been letting you watch, and neither of us has said why, and I am tired of not saying why. So I am putting my hand on this table, and you can take it or you can leave it, and either way I will pour the tea, and we will continue, and the bishop will return to the chair, and the world will keep turning. But I would like you to take it. That is the fact." Samuel looked at her hand, at the knuckles, at the fingers that had saved lives and lost lives and measured ergot to the grain and held babies in the dark. He took it. The kitchen was quiet. The tea cooled. The cat returned to the chair. The rosemary was visible through the window. The evening light came through and touched the herb jars on the shelf and the leather bag by the door and the 2 hands on the table, the Duke's hand and the midwife's hand, holding each other with the careful, deliberate attention of 2 people who understood that hands matter, that touch is not passive, and that some things, once held, should not be let go. Epilogue. The report reached the College of Physicians in November. It was read, discussed, and filed. The board did not mandate hand-washing. The wheels of reform turned slowly, but the report was on record, and records, like ledgers, accumulate. Samuel published a version as a pamphlet, 300 copies, London, Edinburgh, Dublin. It didn't change the law, it changed some minds. And minds, changed one at a time, eventually become a majority. Hannah kept delivering babies. Mrs. Ellis came back. Mrs. Foster named her daughter Hannah. Mrs. Cartwright's sixth, the boy Samuel had watched arrive, grew into a child who followed Hannah around the village because she had been the first person to hold him, and he had apparently decided that this constituted a lifelong appointment. The vicar did not speak to Hannah. He continued to preach. He continued to read from his one book. He continued to believe that women's suffering was purposeful and that his daughter's hands defied God's design. But the village had heard Bridget. The village had heard the coroner. The village had watched Mrs. Foster survive and Mrs. Crane's baby arrive and Mrs. Cartwright's boy follow Hannah down the lane. And the village, which had been afraid of the vicar's word for 32 years, had begun, slowly, in the way that villages change, which is the way that rivers change, which is the way that everything changes, to listen to the woman in the kitchen instead of the man in the surplice. Bridget Healy raised Joan's baby. The baby's name was Joan. Bridget brought her to Hannah every week, not for medical reasons, though Hannah checked her every time, because checking was what midwives did. She brought her because Hannah had held her first, because Hannah had fed her in the chair by the fire while Joan's body cooled, because the first hands that held the baby were the hands they called cursed, and the baby had thrived in those hands, and Bridget wanted the baby to know them. Robert Healy didn't forgive Hannah. He did not need to. His grief was his anger was his. Hannah didn't require his forgiveness. She required only that the baby was well, and the baby was well, and that was enough. Samuel did not leave. He didn't return to Hampshire. He moved his household to a house 2 miles from Thornfield Hollow, a house large enough for a library and a study and a garden, because his reasons for being in Dorset had outlived the report and the inquest and the months of questions, and had become simply a woman with square hands and a one-eared cat, and a still room full of herbs and a way of saying things that required no decoration, and a hand she had placed on a table, palm up, in a kitchen, on an October evening, and that he had taken and that he intended to keep holding. He didn't propose in the conventional manner. He wasn't a conventional man. He proposed in the still room on a Thursday morning while Hannah was weighing a tincture on the brass scales. "I have a question," he said. "I'm measuring. Ergot requires precision." "So does this." She looked up. The brass scales balanced. The measure was exactly right. "Would you like to keep doing this?" he said. "Measuring ergot? All of it. The births, the ledger, the hands, the bag by the door, but with a house that has more than 2 rooms, and a garden larger than a handkerchief, and a library, and me. That's not a question. That's a list. The question is at the end of the list. The question is, and me." Yes. Hannah looked at the ergot on the scales. She looked at the still room, the jars, the herbs, the instruments, the bag with the new clasp. She looked at the bishop, who was sitting on the window-sill and who was watching the proceedings with the detached interest of a cat who has already decided the outcome and is waiting for the humans to catch up. "I will not stop working," she said. "I wouldn't ask you to. I will not be a duchess who attends balls and pours tea and pretends her hands have never been inside a woman's body. I would not want you to. I will continue to wash my hands 4 times per birth and talk to my rosemary and name my animals after clergymen and argue with anyone who tells me that women's pain is God's design. I would be disappointed if you didn't." And the bishop comes. The bishop was always coming. The cat has been the deciding factor since the first day he sat on my notebook." Hannah looked at him, at the blue eyes that had watched her hands for weeks, and that were now watching her face with the face of a man who has asked a question and who is waiting for the answer and who understands that the answer, like ergot, requires precision. "Yes," she said, "but not because you have a library, and not because you have a house, because you watched me catch a baby at 3 in the morning and the word you wrote in your notebook was alive. And because you waited at a gate you didn't need to open. And because you understand that my hands are not a thing to be saved from, they are a thing to be saved for." She put down the scales. She took his hand, the Duke's hand and the midwife's hand. Both washed. The bishop yawned. The following July, in the house 2 miles from Thornfield Hollow, in the bedroom on the first floor, in the early hours of a summer morning, Hannah Wyatt, Hannah Drayton, now, though she used both names, since the Wyatt name was decades of catching babies and she wasn't going to set it down, lay in a bed and held her own daughter. The birth had been attended by Mrs. Cartwright's daughter, a girl of 17 whom Hannah had been training for 2 years, because the Wyatt tradition wouldn't end with Hannah, and the next pair of clean hands was already learning. Hannah had supervised from the bed, which wasn't ideal, and had given instructions between contractions, which was very much her, and had caught her own daughter with her own hands since the girl had come fast, and Hannah's hands had reached before anyone else's, and the hands knew what to do. They always knew. Samuel was beside the bed. He was holding the journal. He hadn't written in it. He had been present for the entire birth, and he hadn't flinched, and he had not fainted, and he had held Hannah's hand when she asked, and let go when she asked, and the letting go had been harder than the holding, which was something he would write about later, when the baby was sleeping, and the house was quiet, and the journal was ready. The baby had Hannah's hands, square, short-fingered, the midwife's hands, the hands that would, in time, learn to wash and to feel and to catch and to hold, the hands they had called cursed, the hands that saved lives. Hannah held her daughter, the daughter who had been delivered by the hands that the world had tried to take from her, the daughter who had arrived in July when the hedgerows were full and the rosemary was blooming and the lane between the village and the house was warm with summer, and the leather bag was by the door, packed and ready, because there was a woman in the next village who was due any day, and the midwife would be needed, and the midwife would come, because that was what Wyatt women did. The cat sat at the foot of the bed. He regarded the baby with the expression of a cat who has seen many arrivals and who considers this one acceptable. "She has your hands," Samuel said. "She has her own hands. She'll decide what to do with them." "I know what she'll do with them." "Don't predict. Observe. That's the first rule of midwifery." "I thought the first rule was wash your hands." "The first rule is wash your hands. The second rule is observe. You're already better at the second than the first." He leaned down and kissed the baby's forehead, then Hannah's, then the hands, the square hands, the scar, the hands that had done everything and would do more. "Alive," he said. "Alive," she said. The word meant more in this room than it had in the journal. The word meant more than a medical outcome. It meant, we are here, both of us, all 3 of us, in a house with a library and a garden and a door that is open and a bag by the door that is packed and a world outside that is still learning, still changing, still catching up to what a woman in a cottage in Dorset has known for 3 generations, that clean hands save lives, that dirty hands end them, and that the woman they called a killer was, and had always been, the one who kept them alive. And that is the story of the woman whose father called her a murderer at a funeral, and the village that believed him, and the duke who stood behind him and heard everything and didn't walk away. It is the story of hands, clean hands, cursed hands, hands that caught babies and held dying women and measured ergot to the grain and pressed against solid things when the world wasn't solid. It is the story of someone very good at a thing the world was trying to take from her, and who refused, absolutely permanently, with her sleeves rolled up and linseed oil on her fingers and a one-eared cat on her window-sill, to let them. The midwives were replaced, not entirely, not everywhere, but across England, in the decades that followed. The doctors came with their degrees and their instruments and their unwashed hands, and the women died in numbers that the midwives' ledgers had never recorded. And when the reformers finally came, when hand-washing became standard, when antisepsis was accepted, when the connection between unwashed hands and infection was finally accepted, the reformers said the discovery was medical. They did not say it was what a village woman in Dorset had known all along. They didn't mention the leather bag, or the brass scales, or the rosemary, or the years of washing. But Hannah knew, and the ledger recorded it. And the record is a permanent thing. Every listen, every comment, every subscription builds this place. And this place is for the women whose hands were called wrong, the women who washed and counted and worked and were replaced by men who didn't wash and didn't count and didn't work as well. The women who knew. If this stayed with you, tell me where it landed. Was it the bells ringing 12? The 47 minutes? Bridget's testimony? The bishop on the chair? The hand on the table, palm up? The ergot on the brass scales? Or was it the baby, born in July with her mother's hands? Drop it below. I read every one. And if you haven't subscribed, the next story is already growing. In a village where a woman was told her hands were cursed, she rolled up her sleeves anyway. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, clean hands save lives. They always have, and the women who knew it first deserved better than they got. Good night. I'll see you in the next one.